So we're going to be doing our research presentation on the revision and validation of the satisfaction and use adapted vehicle evaluation, or SUAVE question. So to begin, we're just going to start with some background information. So as we all know, transportation is vital for productivity, leisure, and self-care activities. However, individuals living with physical impairments tend to face a lot of challenges with regards to transportation. Some studies show that over 40% of them have to rely on others, which we know isn't always feasible, and 70% of them limit their transportation due to accessibility issues, which leads to further social isolation. In addition to that, there's challenges, especially for adolescents who are seeking to get a driver's license, as the typical programs aren't necessarily adapted for those adolescents living with physical impairments. And although there is public transportation, both regular and adapted, there is a lot of accessibility issues with regards to wheelchair accessible stops, as well as like reliability in terms of scheduling. There was a lot of stories that you would see on the news where Transport Adapté would just suddenly cancel the ride and then the person was left stranded and unable to go. For that reason, adapted vehicles have become a preferred solution as it supports greater independence and freedom in order for you to engage in your daily activities. Now, in terms of outcome measures for driving satisfaction use after adaptation, there is currently very limited research on any outcome measures in driving rehab. One of the tools that we did see was the Quebec User Evaluation of Satisfaction with Assistive Technology, or QUEST. However, it's a tool that's available to assess like the ease of use, the effectiveness, the cost, and follow-up support of other assistive technology besides anything in driving rehab. However, it would still be good to look at because you can see the key domains on what's needed to actually measure satisfaction in use, and then that can be taken to create a measure that is more geared towards driving rehabilitation context. So what we did when we looked at the QUEST is some of the important definitions that we would look at is what exactly is satisfaction and what is use. So satisfaction was defined as an individual's overall assessment of a technical aid shaped by its expectations, attitudes, and values, while use was referred to how frequently and effectively a device is used in line with its intended function. So using these definitions and keeping that in mind, the SUAVE questionnaire was originally developed in 2010. It was a client-administered measure through the telephone and was aimed to develop a measure for both proxies and users as well. It was there to assess the levels of use and satisfaction in adaptive vehicles. However, the questionnaire was around 55 questions off, open and closed-ended questions. It was divided into 3 sections as well. So like the first question was background information, which was 25 questions in and of itself. The ease of use section was around 24 questions. And then there's the assessment of satisfaction, which was like another 15. It was just a lot in general. So the study rationale and why exactly we're doing this study is through anecdotal expert feedback. We found a list of severe limitations in the original SUAVE. So a few being that it was lengthy and redundant questions, and that it was also outdated vehicle adaptations. As it was created in 2010, I think there was a modification in 2012, but it hadn't been modified since. So any changes in adaptations weren't taken into consideration in the large tables that were found in the questionnaire. In addition to that, it's a paper format, and the Quebec government requires healthcare institutions to have digital assessments now, so it's outdated in that factor as well. Not only that, it requires extensive resources to administer, as it has to be a clinician to call the client and then fill it on the computer, which would decrease clinician adherence on top of it. Not only that, it was not used for its intended population. It was used for motorcyclists instead of adaptive vehicle users. And the way that they would do is they kind of selected some questions that they felt would fit. So it wasn't necessarily used for its purpose, for its design purpose. So to address these gaps, the development of a revised, validated, and electronic questionnaire is essential. Furthermore, the version should prioritize acceptability and relevance to its intended population as it wasn't originally, and we would incorporate advancements in vehicle adaptation as well. So our study objectives, we have our overall one, which is to revise and validate the content of the SUAVE questionnaire for clients who have physical impairments or their proxies upon acquisition of an adaptive vehicle following a driving rehabilitation program. And then our specific objectives in our study were to review and reduce the items of the original SUAVE, then to validate the content of the revised version of the SUAVE with clinicians specialized in driving rehab, and then to pre-test the revised version of the SUAVE with individuals living with physical impairments or their proxies who use adaptive vehicles.
So now I'm going to talk about the methodology of our project. So for sampling, first of all, we had 2 targeted participant groups. So we consulted clinicians and clients from the Greater Montreal area. The clinicians were from the CIUS Centre-Ouest, Centre-Sud, and the Montérégie West, so more specifically from Constance Lethbridge, Centre Montérégie de Réadaptation, as well as Lucie Bruno. And for the clients, they were from one of our researchers' pool of past patients. So for our recruitment procedure, can you go back? Yeah.
So,
Our initial contact was by telephone or email. It was made by Sylvie, which was our site contact. She gave a brief study description and asked for consent to share contact information with the research team. And then in the second contact, which was made by our team of students, we confirmed participants' consent. We explained in more detail what participation would entail and discussed availability to schedule a clinician focus group, as well as individual interviews for the users. Participation was voluntary, self-selected, and uncompensated. And of the 13 invited clinicians, 6 participated. And of the 11 invited users, we had 5 drivers who participated. Unfortunately, no eligible proxy participants were identified during our recruitment process. So before I get into the phases, I just want to talk about the study design. So our methodology is based on key aspects of measurement development, as well as content validation. Our revision process was done in 3 phases, and only for the client and proxy versions of the SUAVE in French. So in our first phase, so it's the first update of the SUAVE, we modified, removed, or developed new items based on the 3 following points. So our literature search that Ella summarized. So we looked at recent literature on driving rehab. We defined the concepts of satisfaction and use and how these concepts are evaluated in other existing measurement tools. We also used the previous feedback on the limited clinical application of the SUAVE. And we also looked at current practice, what the CIUS requires, such as a lot of things moving into an online format. And maybe also Santé Québec. So for our second phase, it was the content validation of our first updated version based on literature. So it was to identify and improve the clarity of our items. We wanted to know whether they comprehensively represent satisfaction and use, and wanted to know which items are important, which are missing, and as well as the formatting of the response options and verifying if they adequately reflect a range of possible answers through multiple choice. So overall, it allowed us to inquire about the relevance of the measure, whether it responds to clients' and clinicians' needs, and also clinicians' interest in using it in future practice. So for the clinicians, we had a preliminary questionnaire, which was a content validation survey about the clarity and importance of each item of our first updated SUAVE. So we sent it when the consent to participate was obtained, and it was to complete before a focus group, because it was going to be our basis for the focus group discussion. So after we obtained the clinicians' questionnaires, we compiled the data, and we had a 75% agreement threshold for the questions. So for clarity, if 75% of clinicians thought it was clear, we determined that the question was clear enough. And those that didn't meet that threshold, we decided to discuss them in the focus group to ask for more detailed feedback on like specific modifications. So appropriate modifications, and also reaching a consensus with the clinicians on the changes that were most necessary to increase relevance and feasibility in clinical application. After the focus group, thank you. We had cognitive debriefings, so one-on-one interviews with the clients. And it was kind of the same process as the content validation survey, but in telephone format. So we would ask them if each question was clear and if it was important. And similarly, we also got to ask about the appropriateness of language more specifically, for example, layman terms or client-centeredness. And we did the same data analysis for 75% agreement. After these two validations, we had our data analysis. So we combined the percent agreements for clarity and importance for both clinicians and clients together to determine which questions we wanted to modify. And we also summarized the comments and kind of put together some comments were similar between clinicians and clients, but some were contradictory. So we had to put those together and analyze what we thought was relevant to include. So that's what we did for our data analysis. And then for the last phase, which is our final revision and modification, we modified the questions that didn't meet the combined 75%, and we revalidated the technical terminology used for the vehicle adaptations with clinicians because we were having more trouble with that. And then based on that feedback, we made final modifications and converted our Word document into an electronic format with recommendations for software for clinical application. On our next slide. So if we want to summarize what kind of data we collected for the preliminary questionnaire results, we had a lot of dichotomous yes/no data, as well as descriptive data from comments. And other descriptive data was from note-taking and recordings of the focus group and interviews. So our sample, going back, the clinicians had to be occupational therapists with at least 1 year of experience working in driving rehab and being able to communicate in French. And for the clients, we needed high French proficiency and understanding and communicating in French. We also needed access to technology for attending virtual interviews. For the proxies, we wanted them to be family members or caregivers who are driving an adapted vehicle for a passenger with physical limitations. And for the drivers to be eligible, we wanted clients with physical disabilities or other conditions that necessitate vehicle adaptation who were evaluated at the Constance Lethbridge and possessed an adapted vehicle for at least 6 months. Our exclusion criteria was if clients had severe cognitive impairments or other severe conditions that prevented their participation in the interviews, as well as inability to understand French with no access to an interpreter.
So now moving on to the results. So we have phase 1 and phase 2 results that lead to the final SUAVE questionnaire. So to give you an idea of what was done to the original SUAVE questionnaire, as my colleagues mentioned, it had very lengthy items, a lot of redundancy. So 55 items became 24 items. And in those, to give you an idea, in one of the sections, 12 items from the original questionnaire were combined into a table format to be more user-friendly to just check if it applies or not. At that type, the type of modifications that were brought to the survey were really making sure that we combine items and form into sub-questions. A lot of the information that we wanted to obtain from those questions oftentimes needed a precision. So if that was needed to avoid redundancy, we added the option to SUAVE expliquer, and then that would give us more data if that applies to the client precisely. For the equipment mentioned in the tables that were presented in the questionnaire, those were made to be modified to reflect more literature and more up-to-date equipment used in to be more clinically relevant. So to give you an idea for our population, the results, the users, we had a total of 5 users that we interviewed. So we have 3 females, 2 males, age ranging from 30s to older ages up to 80s. And we had the important data we wanted to pull from this was the number of years they've been driving an adapted vehicle. So for some of them, it went up to 40-something years. So we have users with a lot of experience driving adapted vehicles, and that was really rich information that we were able to bring to the questionnaire. And the number of adapted vehicles also, some of them had up to 7 vehicles up to now. With regards to the clinicians, we had 6 clinicians, 5 of whom attended the focus group and 5 who sent their preliminary feedback questionnaire with the ranking of importance and clarity. However, all these topics were discussed during the focus group, so we took the data as is. For sex, we had 5 females, 1 male. And the important data we wanted to pull is that the years of professional practice in driving rehabilitation field, we have clinicians with a lot of experience, more than 2 years, and some even going to 15 to 16 years. For area of practice, what we wanted to show here is that we have clinicians from different centers. So the portrait that we had from the data that we collected isn't only homogeneous to one rehabilitation center, but rather applicable over multiple centers. So now I'm going to be showing bar graphs. So here, as Virginie mentioned, we took the clarity and the importance of each question. Now, the ones I'm showing you today are only the ones that did not reach 75% agreement. So we have the bar graphs, and we see where the distinction is between users and clients is really when we have clinicians saying that for one question, it's not clear at all, but users were 100% clear on the question. So that's when we had that issue to decide, do we edit, do we not, what modifications do we bring? And to clear it up, I'll show you all the modifications that we did bring to the questionnaire. So overall, with clarity and importance, there were 10 questions that were edited. Does anybody stop me at any time if you had questions with regard, because I know some of you participated to the focus group. So with regards to questions that you wanted to know what was the modification, you can stop me at any time for that. So that was clarity. We see these percentage agreements among the both groups. And same thing for importance. So for some questions, clinicians didn't feel that there was a clinical practicality to the question. However, users really found the question important, and it gave them the possibility to develop their question or to give us more insight into what we were asking. So here I have a table summarizing the modifications that we've done. So here, I'm going to read off of the slide because it's a lot of information. For item 5, I'm going to go from English to French. Votre situation à domicile a-t-elle changé depuis l'adaptation de votre véhicule, oui ou non? So here, what the clinicians brought out is that if it did, what's the clinical relevance of getting that information? So what we added to a sub-question is, si oui, a-t-il eu un impact sur votre conduite automobile? So directly targeting if it had an impact on the driving rehabilitation or not. For item number 9, we had a modification also. Some items that were mentioned in the tables, what we did, instead of modifying completely the question, we kept the question as is, but we changed the order of the question. That was something that came up a lot, either during the focus group or during the interviews with clients, because they were like, oh, sometimes they would give us information. I answered this before, so I put the same thing here. So that gave us an indication as to when our questions were repetitive or redundant. So some of them, that's why you won't see a direct modification to the formulation of the question. Puis, item 9, utilisez-vous toujours votre véhicule adapté par le CRCL? Here, we wanted to generalize the question. So by mentioning only one centre de réadapt, we couldn't apply the questionnaire to other centers of rehabilitation. So in this question, on a mis, utilisez-vous à ce jour votre véhicule adapté obtenu suite à une évaluation en ergothérapie au centre de réadaptation? More general. Puis, s'il y a eu une sécession, pourquoi? Ici, on peut préciser. Item number 10. Allez-vous ajouter, supprimer, modifier les adaptations de manière indépendante? Here, the word manière indépendante, with the clarity of users had a difficult time with the clarity of this item, because that manière indépendante, what does it mean? Est-ce que c'est moi qui ai fait les modifications sur véhicule? Non. Those questions came up, and so we modified the question to being, avez-vous ajouté, supprimé, modifié les adaptations après les dernières recommandations du suivi en ergothérapie ou à vos propres frais? So some of them had to pay to have the modification, and some of them, we wanted really to make it clear that if after the eval in occupational therapy, you had any modifications, please precise and why. So it gives us more detailed content. Ooh. Après ça, on a item 14. Combien d'heures par semaine passez-vous dans le véhicule? Number 14. Here, on a changé la question et on a même rajouté une question. So, combined, combien d'heures par semaine passez-vous dans votre véhicule? Si variable, d'une semaine à l'autre, veuillez indiquer une moyenne. Fait que a lot of them, it depends on what they were using the vehicle for, when was it? And to be more specific to the Quebec context, we wanted to add an item, or sub-question to this item, which was, votre utilisation de votre véhicule adapté est-il influencée par la météo, les saisons, oui ou non? This came up not as a comment directly from clinicians, but more from users that, ben ça dépend de quelle saison tu me parles. So then when they would answer the question, it was influenced by their perceived time of the year it was. So to be more relevant to the Quebec context, we wanted to add this part in. Puis si oui, cela a-t-il eu un impact sur votre conduite automobile? Encore une fois, once again, we're honing in on the item, the question that we want to get from this result. So next we had item 17. Utilisez-vous d'autres modes de transport? Oui, non. Si oui, quel type? Là, on avait beaucoup de types. Puis si oui, pour quelle occasion? Here, both clinicians and clients, it has a lot of data, a lot of potential check marks. So it was more confusing au niveau de la clarté et l'importance. Fait qu'on l'a modifié pour utilisez-vous des modes de transport autres que votre véhicule adapté? Comme ça, oui ou non? Fait que ça reste pareil. Si oui, quel type? Transport en commun régulier, transport public adapté. Fait que ça, c'est une discrepancy that was between the terminology that we use, because some of them thought that adapté wasn't the STM, but then if it was STM, it was regular. So just to make it more broad and less confusing for that category to check off the point. Puis, si oui, pour quelle occasion? We left that because although it could be redundant, some users mentioned that by seeing that list, it makes them think of every opportunity they have to use the vehicle. Puis après ça, we left a description. So, expliquer pourquoi votre véhicule adapté n'est pas utilisé pour ces activités. If it's the case being, sometimes it's other factors than the desire for the user to use their vehicle. It's other factors around that can influence their use. So that we wanted to have a precision. Now for the tables A, B, and C, as you can see by the bar graphs, I don't know if you remember, je peux retourner. Table B and C, they all had very low ratings au niveau de la clarté and also l'importance. Okay, and that's because there's a lot of items to discuss in a lot of modifications that are written, maybe more clinician-based in the questionnaire. We have to keep in mind this is going to be a self-administered questionnaire. So we really wanted to see, do the users understand the terminology put in? And also, is the terminology adequate to represent what goes on as adaptations in the Centre des radars? So in that case, what we decided at the end of the modification is that these tables require further investigation for clinicians of different sites, and there's the potential aspect of personalizing that table to the site where applicable. So this is still an investigation going on. And for the question 22, commentaire additionnel sur l'utilisation de la satisfaction des adaptations du véhicule. Now here, it was questioned why the importance of this question to apply, why is it needed? And no modification was added because users did find it really crucial to have this place some information they couldn't find where to put it in the questionnaire elsewhere. So that was a place where they could describe, they could say anything that they wanted to say while finalizing the questionnaire. And lastly, one other addition was made to the SUAVE following the focus groups and the users, mostly the cognitive debriefing with the users. And it is combien d'entretiens et réparations devez-vous effectuer sur votre véhicule adapté par année? Est-ce que devoir réparer les bris mécaniques de votre véhicule adapté affecte votre satisfaction et utilisation du véhicule adapté? So we know that in this field particularly, it was something that was brought up by users directly that vehicles need to be repaired on a more frequent basis due to potential bugs or connection or anyways, how to mention it is, so there's a lot of stuff going on in the vehicle, and they say that oftentimes it's something that they're worried about or that it can influence the fact that they use it often. So we thought it was pertinent that, let's say we say that they have 12 réparations par année, then that user is going to the garage at least 12 times per year. And how does that influence their satisfaction with the vehicle or even their desire to use the vehicle at the end of the day? So we thought it was important to precise. Yeah, je vais vous laisser avec Clara.
Okay, so moving on to the discussion. So firstly, I'll go through the overview, then I'll go on to the actual practical implications of it, and then our strengths and limitations, and then I'll move into the future research followed by the key messages. So firstly, with the overview, our study produced a concise self-report version of the SUAVE, reflecting best practices in centered care that emphasize clarity, efficiency, and alignment with user needs. The revised questionnaire incorporates improved clarity, reduced redundancy, as we saw, and a more logical organization that differentiates between a wheelchair entry, transfer-based entry, and the driver control adaptations of the vehicle. Those were done through the tables, and these modifications bring the tool in congruence with the reality of users with adapted vehicles. And it also captures their experience of the targeted populations to support realistic clinical decision-making. The original SUAVE report was a client administered, as we saw, over the telephone that took approximately 20 minutes to administer, contained multiple open and closed-ended questions, and included very detailed adaptation tables. And as we saw as well, they were also outdated. And according to its co-developers, while it was comprehensive, it did exhibit a lot of redundancy, over-complexity, disorganization, and outdated adaptation examples, resulting in occasional comprehension challenges and low utilization. So the revised version is shorter, it's modernized, it's more optimized for electronic formats. It preserves the conceptual definitions of the satisfaction and use drawn from the quest, while updating adaptation examples, restructuring sections for easier navigation, and simplifying terminology to reduce respondent burden and increase data accuracy as backed by current literature. So moving on to practical implications, the content validation process, it comprised, as we saw, of clinician survey, the clinician focus group, and then the client feedback. And it ensured that the retained items were both relevant and understandable from both parties. And as we saw from the results of this process, key modifications were made based on clarity and importance rating. So similar to the original SUAVE report, the removal of the proxy version during this process does reflect recruitment challenges. However, this data does remain a priority for future work. Should such findings become more accessible, proxy-specific questions could be incorporated into the questionnaire to broaden insight from this perspective, which is crucial to obtaining, especially as OTs, a holistic understanding of all experiences surrounding adapted living. The revised SUAVE can be utilized in vehicle adaptation follow-up in identifying usage and therapeutic compliance barriers such as device alterations, training refreshers, and environmental modifications as commonly reported in existing studies. So the consolidated data can inform also program improvement and policy development, including SAEQ funding strategies and evaluation service protocols. That sort of information we also gained from the clients from their perspectives of as Andrea mentioned, the common issues that they face with their adapted vehicles. And according to recent findings, the electronic formatting could also streamline administration and facilitate integration into clinical practice. So now strengths and limitations. So some of the strengths of the studies included the inclusion of both clinician and client perspectives in decision-making. Of course, obtaining this feedback from the clients allowed us to gain insight on things that we may not have thought of prior to the study. So this ensured both reflection from both user and clinician experiences, as they will be the ones using this questionnaire. Context-specific terminology and recognizable device descriptions tailored to Quebec's adapted driving technology, because in the previous SUAVE, there was a very comprehensive list of adaptations that either were no longer used, very rarely used, or not even used in Quebec at all. And we also made some clarity improvements, as you saw, over successive iterations, enhancing ease of completion and interpretation. Some of the limitations, however, included the use of convenience and purposive sampling, which can limit the generalizability of the findings. The study's small sample size, which may reduce its statistical power and representation of the broader targeted population. The absence of proxies from the survey testing, excluding its intended applicability to caregiver-mediated cases as well, which is very often the case and is very relevant in these situations. Possible time commitment and perceived relevant barriers to participation, as well as sampling, which could have discouraged participation and introduced response bias. And finally, the influence of English and French terminology, as commonly seen in Quebec in a bilingual population, causes variation on device recognizability and item interpretation. So moving on. Future implications. So with this, future research should include psychometric testing, such as structural validity, reliability, as well as larger, more diverse samples with cross-linguistic validation, with the reintroduction and validation of a proxy module remaining a priority. Developing a user-friendly online hybrid administration model that combines both self-reporting with clinician reviewing should be explored, with in mind that clinicians' time availability can vary, so that would also have to be explored in a more thorough aspect. So particularly for items involving technical terminology, as a lot of users did have adapted devices but could not identify what the names were, so assistance from clinicians would definitely benefit in that area. With these developments, long-term integration of the SUAVE into clinical practice can offer valuable insight on the effectiveness of OT interventions, provide a deeper understanding of the client needs, and generate longitudinal data to support preventative measures that align with emerging technology in the driving rehabilitation field. So, conclusion, the revised SUAVE is a practical, client-centered outcome measure with improved clarity, relevance, and applicability, especially compared to its predecessor. It is both appropriate for clinical and research settings, supporting effective follow-up and providing actionable insight for enhanced service delivery and policy change in adapted driving rehabilitation. And with this, further validation, broader implementation, and the inclusion of a proxy module will strengthen its utility and generalizability as a standard measure of satisfaction and use of adapted vehicles. So some key findings, to avoid being redundant, I will simply list the three below. So the revised SUAVE, again, is a concise, clinically relevant, and designed to meet both the needs of the clients and the clinicians during the rehab process. The study's findings highlight key differences, as we saw in the bar graphs, of client and clinician perspectives, offer user-specific insight into accessibility barriers beyond the CLRC and the other associated rehabilitation centers, and identify areas for targeted improvements in adapted vehicle policy, services, funding, and rehabilitation practices in general. And ongoing use of the questionnaire can monitor the satisfaction and use of vehicle adaptations over time, enable preventative measures, and refine OT practices and provide insight for future research in the field of driving rehabilitation. Those are our resources, and you can go next. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for this concise and very clear presentation. And now we'll open the floor for a question.